My mind works too fast. Poetry makes it work slower. So in terms of craft, what I find myself doing in a poem and then in a revision to a poem is going back into those essential images and trying to find everything in them, as opposed to skipping forward as quickly as the mind wants me to do. It's so often a process of going back into that initial moment and redeeming or retaining or remembering or mining for everything that's there. Where rhetoric would do for maybe a more skilled poet, for me, when I don't know what to do in the poem, I turn back to the natural world and the world of lived experience. The thing that does that is the image, because it is embodied. Because images are temporal, they're limited, they often for me come from nature, and they reintroduce into the poem the necessity and the gravity of something real. And the danger, I think, for the poem is that in that space of language, which is so prone to all of our strangenesses and fantasies and desires, it'll just fly off into fantasy or desire. And it should get to do that. In terms of the shape of the poem, though, we have to live on earth. And what I've always wanted from poems is something that would help me live on earth. I think when you're writing poetry, something that is very real is the amount of internal rhyme and chime that the line itself brings you. It just comes up because part of what you're doing is trying to assert connections within existence. And something the linguists always say about poetry is that there simply is more rhyme and repetition of sound within a poem than there is in ordinary speech. And I think that's true. And I think because of that, something I notice in my own work is internal rhyme, rhymes that kind of come up in the halfway through or in the middle of the line. And I notice as well the repetition of words, not because I've put them in any poetic form, but because they seem to keep coming up. These words are sometimes keys to what's happening in the poem, but they also then govern what's going on by asking other words to join them. So the words mother and father and other and sister and brother, words for family that I've noticed have come up in my poems, especially since I had a baby. But then all the other words that come up that end in ER, like laughter and falter and alter, that seem to then come up intuitively and cluster sort of around them. I was lucky enough to take a class once on Chinese poetry, the classic tradition. And it was taught to us that in a Chinese poem, what sometimes happened in the last line or in the last gesture of the poem was a change in perspective. And so a gaze that was focused on the earth would become focused on the sky. A mind looking at the mountains would all of a sudden see a river. A bird that seemed static would fly. And this change paralleled a change in spirit or in possibility, in status, in regard, in affection, in love or in understanding for the speaker. And I remember when I thought about that, I started to wonder about what the prehistory of the volta was before it became something we did in the sonnet. And I still wonder, what is the prehistory of the volta? It seems to me, though, it's something that begins in the body. That a change in mind is necessitated by a change in something that happens in the body. That voltas are happening all the time because as we move our bodies through nature, nature is constantly shifting us. That the wisdom of the Volta is that poetry can isolate and make bearable the essential change that is the nature of the universe. Never on a revision am I trying to make things clearer. I'm never trying to make things more understandable. I'm never trying to bring the meaning to the top of the poem. If anything, what I cut is, I think, like the way that Robert Bresson talks about in the Notes from a Cinematographer, to make the cuts make more meaning possible in between them. And so I often take out things that feel explicative. I don't break up a sentence so that it's easier for the reader to swallow it. I break it up so it's more beautiful on the plate. I think it's great when they do, but we shouldn't be surprised when the sense they make of something can't immediately be put into words. And so, yes, but we shouldn't confuse that with some immediate ability to re-articulate what the poem said. A poem is an experience, and it wants you to learn that wisdom by doing it, not by hearing it. Sometimes I think that poetry gets a reputation as either the art of the solitary worker or as a kind of collective and communal project, a song, that we split ourselves in poetry into Whitman's and Dickinson's. But I think the truth is that poetry is the possibility of both of those voices coming together. The part of us that just wants to be left alone and part of us that knows that we have to live with other people. And something I guess I've been thinking about is how many poems are about precisely that. The possibility of living with other people, the reality of living with other people, whether or not you think you can live with other people in the woods the way that Frost did, or whether or not you think that living with other people like Frank O'Hara is like the funnest thing you ever did. It's still about that. And I guess I've been thinking about that when you go to the page as a poet, there are all sorts of other people there